some time now, those in the pro-Ukraine community have been operating on the idea that Trump's team and many of his advisors are getting bad information, that they may have bad preparations for negotiations. We haven't been looking at, I won't even call it the worst case scenario, but the more likely scenario that there is bad intent there. This episode of Silicon Bites is going to unpack these ideas that have been knocking around for some time, but now are crystallizing based on statements that are being made by Trump, the Trump team, and the unpleasant spat that has emerged between Zelensky and President Trump. Before we jump into the video, thank you to everybody who has helped support the channel and including help support run events this year. We are aiming to have very high profile, high impact events to help move the dialogue towards supporting Ukraine for victory. And that has now become more imperative than ever. So what are we seeing from the Trump negotiation team and the various statements that are coming out? We are certainly seeing bad information, bad sources of information that have been injected into Trump's information sphere and many of the people that are surrounding him. It seems that those individuals who have slightly better information, including General Kellogg, are at real risk of being sidelined. There is clearly bad preparation going on as well. We'll unpack that a bit later in the episode. Certainly there's a high degree of naivety, it seems, or we can presume from some of the statements that have been made, including this extraordinary idea that the US will be able to peel Russia away from China and in that way deal with what it perceives to be the greater threat. We're going to try and unpack that because actually this feels to me like a Russian strategy. This feels to me like a China strategy of divide and conquer. It's risky, it's dangerous, and historic precedents suggest that it is, with a high degree of probability, doomed to failure. In fact, may make the situation far, far worse. What we can also say is that the Trump negotiating position is quite clearly not grounded in any values, and equally it is not limited by any sense of values and morality either. Some will call it transactional. I'm going to unpack why I think that phrase is no longer applicable, why I think in some ways it's even disingenuous to talk about the art of the deal or to talk about Trump as a transactional player. That is to normalize what in essence is turning out to be a mafia-inspired strategy. So I don't think it's that useful to get fixated on this idea of whether it's bad information or bad intent. Either way, it's going to be extremely difficult to overturn the bad information, probably still worth trying, but if it's bad intent, there is very little that can be done with that. Good information will not push out bad intent, and it's becoming, I think, clearer from Trump's actions, from Trump's phrases, and from the people he is seeking to associate himself with, that there is a high degree of bad intent there from him and indeed from many people in his circle. And what should we focus on? Well, I always look not at the words Trump utters, but the tone of those words, the tone of the phrases, especially phrases and ideas that he repeats more than once. What we can see in his words and phrases is this sense of grievance, the idea that he, and by extension the US, has been deceived and swindled by both allies, partners, and often to a lesser extent by adversaries, the ones that are genuinely doing the swindling. He talks about trade imbalances. He talks about bad deals. And to an extent, there is almost the implication, and this is very Putinesque in some ways, that everything that is a problem for the US, everything that is making the US weaker, is by extension a personal slight to him as well. It's quite clear that all his relationships are, to an extent, transactional. They are monetary in nature, and they are extremely short-term. Unfortunately, these three qualities seem to be driving the negotiation process and the lens through which Russia's war against Ukraine is being viewed as well. And the sense of alliances not being strategic, not being for the long term, seeing alliances as actually a mechanism to apply pressure, to even extort, and looking at alliances that are only there to produce some immediate quid pro quo This seems to be very much at the forefront of Trump's thinking. It's short term, it's intemperate, it's impatient, and often it lacks nuance and any kind of depth or historical context. And Trump can be seen to reject the very treaties that he brokered as well, going against his own presumed self-interests, the NAFTA agreement between Mexico and Canada, which he seems disposed to just tear up and throw in the bin. He also will label anything that Biden or Obama did as bad, irrespective of whether they are good or bad. And what's absolutely new, what's absolutely terrifying, is the idea that legal contracts, international agreements made by any of his predecessors are open to being torn up. More than that, if they are to remain in place, he is minded to unilaterally change the terms of reference, the conditions under which those were written. So, for instance, military aid is provided to Ukraine by Biden. And a lot of that aid is values-based. It's there to help Ukraine survive because that is the right thing to do. It's there to help Ukraine survive because that aligns with values such as freedom and democracy. You could argue whether it's enough or not enough till the cows come home, but it is a values-based proposition. It is also aligned with US strategic interests. Trump has no concept of values-based agreements, no concept of values-based relationships. They are purely transactional. They are purely monetary in a sense. And one has to question whether he is looking through the lens of what helps the US, helps me. I think it's the reverse. What helps me may, coincidentally, help the US. And if it doesn't really matter. There are, of course, 2 points of view on the war, which have prevailed over the last 3 years. And there is, to an extent, a battle over these, a battle which in the last couple of days has flipped decisively. One story is that Ukraine's resistance is a principled defense of democracy and sovereignty. It is the embodiment of selfless values, a country that is trying to survive a genocidal, illegal assault by its imperialistic, dictatorial neighbor. That is the story which most Western democracies align with. That is the story which nominally the US aligned with until just recently. But there is another story, and that story has gained traction in the last couple of months. That story has never really gone away in many parts of the world where Russia has influence. And indeed, that story is very, very different. It tells of Ukraine being guilty, not for resisting, but Ukraine is guilty of not capitulating and resisting absorption by the Russian world and needs to be punished for that. All the labels like denazification, demilitarization, all these kind of stuff all emanate from this core story. And here are, I think, the 4 strategic objectives which could now be broadly applied to the main power blocks in the world. Broadly speaking, this label can be applied to the Western democracies, that actually this is a war, a struggle of authoritarian regimes trying to snuff out democracy, a kind of axis of evil, axis of intolerance that needs to be resisted. Russia's point of view is the one that it has always had throughout the Cold War and indeed through its long imperial history, that is, divide the US from its Western partners, make the US complicit in Russia's criminality, make the US betray its allies, destroy its relationships, and in the process over the long term, destroy itself and its power. China is a little more inscrutable, but potentially their point of view is let Russia and the West attrit themselves, and when that process is over, China will be in a strong position to define the new global order. So what is the US position now? Well, until recently, it was broadly aligned with the Western point of view, albeit it may see Russia not as the main threat. It may see the Russia-Ukraine war as something of a regional problem rather than a global problem. But broadly speaking, it's aligned around the same values. Now that has decisively changed. I think the US attitude is, if you can't beat them, collude with them. And this idea of peeling Russia away from China is probably one of the most absurd things I've heard in all of these 3 years and all of the 4 years of Trump's previous presidency. But it seems the ground has been laid for this quite cleverly and incrementally over the last few years. And when we say if you can't beat them, collude with them, we mean collusion in a grand imperial project, a carve-up of the world, a worldview that looks at things in an extreme transactional, resource extraction-based mentality. It comes from a point of view of scarcity, threat, extreme Darwinism, and it inevitably leads to hot conflict and competition that is intense yet informal and not governed by a rules-based framework. Ending Russia's war against Ukraine was always going to be a difficult task. And what we know about Trump is he does not do well with complexity, he does not do well with nuance, he does not do well with things that take time and investment of effort and complex strategy. So perhaps it was inevitable that he'd choose to take the path of least resistance. What is that? We need to be absolutely clear what Trump now sees as the path of least resistance. I think he sees the fall of Ukraine as the fastest solution to ending the war, not the fall of Russia. This, in some ways, mirrors his Afghan strategy, which is to set up a defeat, set up a situation where the US presence in Afghanistan was no longer tenable, but then let the next administration carry the can for that. This time, however, I think he's perfectly comfortable for the defeat of Ukraine to be something that he owns. He is gearing up to lie and gaslight about that defeat, to power through and not take any blame for it. And there are numerous assumptions behind this strategy, if indeed this is the one he is adopting. And I think deep Russian disinformation narratives have been injected very widely into his circle and over many, many years, if not decades. It's going to be an extreme challenge, not just to unseat the core beliefs that he seems to have, but even peeling away some of the most ardent voices around him, some of whom are out and out grifters. That is going to be next to impossible. Why do we think this? Well, in anger, in frustration, he's starting to reveal some of the things that he genuinely thinks, not just the sort of sound bites that he throws against the wall like spaghetti. The words like Ukraine shouldn't have started the war and Ukraine refused to negotiate for 3 years. I think we're getting beyond the random phrases that he throws out to unsettle and unnerve his adversaries, that he throws out there to weaponize the information space. No, I think we are now getting down to things that he genuinely believes. He believes Ukraine's failure is not one to win the war, but it's a failure to submit to force, a force that he sees as superior. A Ukrainian failure to resist violence, a Ukrainian failure to not see the world as he sees it, which is purely transactional. He asks, what are you dying for? And he thinks, why are you dying when you could be making money instead? There's no values behind his view of the world. There's no empathy behind it either. He calls Zelensky a dictator. Never mind that Zelensky is the mandated head of the Ukrainian state, and by law, he cannot hold elections. He'd be breaking the law, he'd be breaking the constitution. And almost all the key opposition leaders support Zelensky in the idea of not holding elections at this point. Not only is it seen as impractical, it is also seen as a way that Russia could utilize that process to destabilize Ukraine and destabilize its resistance in wartime. This is well understood by mature democracies, but this phrase is being used as a weapon by Trump and many in the kind of information podcast environment that informs his worldview. It's also being a key Kremlin talking point for a number of months, and there is an intensification of that now because they understand what a powerful strategy it is to weaken Ukraine's resistance. And of course, Trump makes no mention of the fact that Russia has not held a free and fair election for nigh on 20 years. That Putin, even before that, was able to coerce the media and the information environment in Russia to stack the cards in his favor. There is no mention of Russian crimes. There is no mention of Russian violence. There's no mention of illegality and the widespread interference in Western democracies. Well, quite the reverse. J.D. Vance recently said, when he had Romanian politicians in the audience, that they should not have protected their democracy and their democratic processes against highly weaponized at scale Russian interference. Now, there are several potential outcomes. There are several things being discussed. I will say which one I think is most probable at this point. Again, this is neither true nor a fact because things can change, but certainly some things are becoming much clearer. Here are several views on what kind of peace may take shape. Well, those who either are within MAGA or are seeking to try and find some silver linings to what Trump is doing may claim that Trump has a grand strategy and that ultimately his erratic behavior will screw Putin. The fact that Ukraine and Europe have been excluded from negotiations is explained away by the numerous communications that Europe still has with General Kellogg and others, and it's said that no, the US will pull in its allies in Ukraine at a later date. I think this is becoming increasingly less likely. If Trump's plan is to extort Ukraine, even to carve Ukraine up in a new Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then bringing Ukraine itself and Europe into those negotiations, countries that are still values-led rather than purely transactional, will be a very bad idea on his part because it does not align at all with the plans that he has either for Ukraine or for the New World Order. Another idea doing the rounds, and this one may not necessarily be Trump's intention, but it could be the reality that emerges, and that is that you'll negotiate a very bad peace, but it will be contingent and temporary, and Ukraine will not permanently cede territories to Russia. And then when Russia collapses, Ukraine will regain territory, if not some justice as well. The challenge with this strategy is starting to emerge too, because Trump is talking about lifting sanctions on Russia. This makes a potential collapse of the Russian imperial project less likely. It means he can dribble on like a zombie empire, seeding new wars and new aggression. So this option may have looked relatively likely a few weeks ago. Now I think it is far less likely. And here we get to where I think we are heading. The US will betray and extort Ukraine. It will seek to divide it and conquer it for the materials it can gain in that process. This is a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact for the 21st century, a monumental and historic betrayal and failure, a Lavrov-Rubio Pact that will bring shame to the US for eternity. If this is the course we're on, it represents extreme transactionalism with no foundation in values and indeed an entire lack of historical context and understanding. Where I think we're at is that many in the Trump team are simmering in a warm bath of misinformation surrounded by paid actors and grifters. This strategy reeks of a new imperial arrogance, exceptionalism, breathtaking hypocrisy, and gaslighting on an unbelievable scale. It moves the world back to an 18th or even earlier. It moves the world back to an 18th century view of geopolitics, and that is extreme spheres of influence and dominance with a very extraction and extortion-led mindset. But it is, in Trump's view, the path of least resistance, seeking what is easy and quick. Now, of course, many people watching this channel will understand that that is a false assumption. Ukraine has shown itself able to resist. Ukraine has shown that Putin's three-day operation would actually be neither easy nor quick in reality. And I think this same issue applies here. Trump also believes that the majority of money helping to fund Ukraine and helping to keep it resistant comes from the US. That is also not true. The majority is provided by Europe. around 20 billion more than the total provided by the US. And Trump's strategy now may well drive Europe to significantly expand the support that it is providing to Ukraine. It may force Europe to change its mindset from supporting Ukraine to survive to actually supporting Ukraine to win. This could be the greatest own goal in history. And of course, just like Putin's decision to go to war was based on wrong assumptions, Trump's view of ending the war quickly and easily through this method is also based on poor assumptions. It assumes that Ukraine is losing and is destined to be defeated and overrun. It assumes Ukraine is losing and is destined to be defeated and overrun. This is by no means inevitable at all, and Ukraine have shown that they have extreme agency within this to stop that happening. Trump believes that Ukrainians have fought for nothing and died for nothing. This message is also echoed in a lot of propagandistic channels and the kind of libertarian, evangelical, alt-right media sphere. Well, this is not true at all. Ukraine is fighting for many values, for its language, for its democracy, for its freedom, for its identity, for its literature, for the ability to express itself freely and to have a political life, the ability to fight and push back corruption and oligarchy, and ultimately, what they value more than anything else is not to be governed by Russia, Russism, or have their society Russified all over again. Another foundational misinterpretation of what's going on is the belief that is widespread that actually Maidan was a CIA coup, that the war has been initiated only because Ukraine wanted to join NATO and because this is all Biden's decisions anyway. None of these is remotely true, but the fact they form some of the foundational beliefs of Trump and his team mean that whatever conclusions they come to is based on extremely poor information and very shaky foundations. Also, this idea that's expressed that really both sides want peace and are coming from a place of good intent, and Ukrainians are just being, led by bad leaders, and ultimately they want peace at any price. This is not true, not in any way. Anyone who's spoken to even a handful of Ukrainians will know that this is nonsense. The other belief is that Ukraine is now a dictatorship and that it needs democratic elections for legitimacy. No, the absolute opposite is true at the moment. Ukraine will have elections at the right time. They may even eject Zelensky from the leadership, and he will go peacefully because Ukraine is a democracy and it values democratic process. No, the reason that there is a push for elections now from the Russian side is because they think, one, it can weaken Ukrainians, divide them, distract them, but they also know that a full and fair election cannot take place in the context of war. So if Ukraine was to forced to have an election, it's likely that Russia and Trump will turn around and then declare the winner of that process illegitimate, the process itself illegitimate, and all of that effort will have been squandered for nothing. Finally, I think Trump doesn't care what Ukrainians want. He doesn't care what they think. He perceives them to be weak. He perceives that they cannot protect their resources, including the mineral resources, so they are ripe for him to come in and take them. That is another catastrophic assumption that is at variance with the reality. So how bad can things get? Well, I think it's worth outlining some of the worst case scenarios right now, both in tactical and strategic terms, so that we can prepare against them. First of all, we may see the US mount an effort for the mass extortion of minerals and rare earth metals. We'll see Trump seeking to push the Ukrainian government to sign a bad deal. Maybe they'll tweak the catastrophic, awful, dreadful, horrible deal they already drew up. They might try to sell it as completely revamped and fair. It will not be. So beware for extortion. A recent Telegraph article, and if people aren't aware, this is a conservative newspaper in the UK, actually described Trump's mineral extortion deal as worse, far worse even than the reparations that were imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War. That is an adversary, not an ally. We know that Trump is repeating the Kremlin line about forcing elections. They are seeking to depose Zelensky because he's corrupt? No, because he's effective, because the majority of Ukrainians are united behind them. It's been more than 50% throughout the 3 years of full-scale war. Now it is ticking upwards as the pressure mounts. It is closer now to 57%, 63%, which two recent polls put it at. What Russia and Trump as their asset are trying to do is sow division and conflict. What else is Trump trying to do? Well, he's trying to return oligarchy to Ukraine. This is Russia's prime objective because it is through the mechanics of oligarchy and oligarchs that it is able to exert some control over the future direction of Ukraine. Now, this is not just sponsored by Russia. This move is sponsored by the US as well. Watch out, Europe, because American oligarchy is coming to you too. Trump could insist on the withdrawal of satellite information and limitations on Starlink. This has been crucial support and crucial intelligence during the Ukrainian war effort. We should be aware now that this may be coming to an end, and Trump, with his relationship with Elon Musk, is in prime position to act upon this. We should also assume that any intelligence made available to the US may well be shared with Russia and its proxies as well. And with an easing of sanctions, which would be a shocking move, we can expect the US to try and put pressure on allies to remove and lift their sanctions as well. And the US may start to drop its pressure to release the $300 billion of Russian central bank assets. If Europe is paying attention, if Europe is serious about not just Ukrainian victory, but surviving, we need to make that $300 billion available to Ukraine ASAP and ignore what the US says. With the lifting of sanctions, we may also start to see the US selling military components and even machine tools that can be used in Russia's war industries. This would be a catastrophe if that was the case. It means that many other countries, many other players would also seek to do the same. And we could see a rapid buildup of Russian strength, manufacturing strength once more. Normalization of relations with Russia mean a normalization of its war economy. So beware the lifting of sanctions. We've already seen that negotiations are taking place without Ukraine and Europe, and we're starting to see huge concessions being suggested in those negotiations as well. Putin has had many demands over the years. It seems that a huge number of these demands are now going to be acquiesced to, including the Arctic being a major sphere of Russian influence. This is something they've been talking about for several decades. How is Trump going to seek to get away with all of this? Well, he's going to try to shift the blame onto Ukraine for resisting and even for starting the war. We should be ready. This isn't guaranteed to happen, but we are heading in this direction. We could see the US block Ukrainian security and any ideas that enhance that security. We could see the US block Ukrainian membership of NATO. We could see the US try to frustrate the emerging European security force and put pressure on countries like the UK not to ramp up institutions such as the Joint Expeditionary Force. Again, we need to ignore that and now act in a unilateral fashion. What we'll also see is bad faith actors and grifters, people who may or may not be Russian assets and agents, such as Tucker Carlson and Alexei Arestovich. We will see them fomenting civil war and division. Civil war in Ukraine, that's not going to happen, but we will certainly see many narratives that try to push towards catastrophic internal disagreements in any country that actively supports Ukraine. That includes the UK with Tommy Robinson and others, and that includes the UK with Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, Reform, and other entities. And in fact, that operation has been going on for a number of decades now. And what is the outcome of all of this? Well, it's already happening. It was happening even before Trump made his announcements, when the shock in Ukraine, the shock that troops are feeling who are reading and consuming this news, people who are fighting for their lives and have been doing so for many months and years, when the shock turns to resentment, when it turns to a sense of betrayal, when it's only the UK and Europe that can have any hope of recovering trust with Ukraine and its defenders. And we will need that. We will need those defenders because they will be a key part of the vanguard to keep Russia out of Europe in the coming years. So rather than ending this episode with a sense of despair, I think we need to have a sense of action. What action do we take now? Because time is running out. Well, first of all, we need to work on better narratives and injecting good information into anyone associated with the GOP, and that includes MAGA as well. We need to counter the propagandistic narratives that unfortunately are gaining ground. We need to build the resistance to slow Trump down through all legal mechanisms available in the US. Thwart him, challenge him, sue him, slow his decisions, slow his legislation down. The UK needs to lead from the front. Potentially, we now need to commit troops to Ukraine. And we cannot wait for the US and its so-called peace process. And we cannot wait for the US and its so-called peace process to be brokered. If we wait for the US peace deal, and that peace deal turns out to be a disaster, then it will be too late to prevent it. We also need to wake up and accept that for now, at least, the transatlantic alliance is dead. If we try to cling on to that security, it will simply drag us down. NATO, by extension, is also ineffective. We now need to move to smaller and more agile groups and organizations that work, that can be in action, and that can create focused, impactful plans to resist Russia. This is a dangerous time, and we all have now our parts to play. If you can, help support this channel because we're scaling up our activity and we're scaling up the events we run and the advocacy that we'll be adopting to try and change government policy towards supporting Ukraine for victory with all the resources and intelligence that we have.